Chapter 6: Cycles of Abuse. Made permanent shortly before our lives changed, I continued to work full-time, remaining focused on bettering my career path. The standard of workmanship and work ethic held to my work experiences in a third-world country has by far surpassed the level held to some first-world countries I have worked in. Each floor held to its level a kitchen maid responsible for emptying paper bins, dusting work desks, vacuuming offices, and delivering refreshments wheeled on a trolley at 8 a.m., 10 a.m., and 2 p.m. I interacted well with all walks of life. I had become good friends with a secretary on the ground level through interaction of booking meeting rooms with her department. She introduced me to my second husband, who is not and has not been a part of our lives directly for many years. I often state still that my first husband, my only husband, and my late husband. 10 years my senior, he was a former police officer in the Transvaal and had relocated to KwaZulu-Natal to head a forensic ballistic department. I was reluctant to start a relationship, and alarm bells rang in my head. He had sole custody of 2 sons. Overall, this man just seemed too pedantic. His mannerisms held traits of OCD, and on occasion, in social settings, I thought he was struggling to maintain a calm exterior. His history was not forthcoming and held reluctance to my many questions in relation to his family and his open hatred for women. My life already had been spinning so out of control, it was like I was stuck on a merry-go-round that blurred out all logical sense. As change kept coming so fast, my position never stayed the same to gain proper footing. Instead of taking a step back for just a second, I doubted my intuition and the alarm bells in my head to liken my decision to another's pleasing, to be right. My mother subtly pushed the connection forwards to approve of something in my sphere for the first time in my life. I do not pretend to blame or even criticize her undertones, because it was my decision held to my actions only that holds direct blame to again not have been strong enough to consider what I wanted enough to say no. He later placed full blame of the many failures held to the woman in his life to a mother who had walked out of a family and marriage impulsively one afternoon before his return from school, to not have afforded an explanation nor respected that her children may have needed her to remain within their family unit. His first wife and the biological mother of his 2 sons, he told me, was mentally unstable, having spent considerable time in psychiatric units, and a second marriage was short-lived due to a woman's physical beating of him. Schizophrenia and depression ran in his family. I formed an instant bond with his sons. The younger of the 2 had been brought into this life in a weak moment of sex, booze, and a one-night stand held to another's name. This child needed much attention and proper love, as I later found out he had been abused in many forms by the adults in his life. Information came to light over many months to hear how he had been tied to a tree and repeatedly raped by older step-brothers, and that my now husband was not in fact his biological father. It was he who cried in front of a little church begging me not to marry his father because he was going to hurt me. It was too late, I told him, too late to turn around and walk away. I'm sure there were many logical factors and reasons to not walk down the aisle that afternoon. I was just not able to stop that merry-go-round that had become so blurred over such a long time, to believe that love has to hurt to be right. The consequences of my decision were shown to me that evening, as the man I now called my legal partner became irate and shoved me with unloving, unkind force to ready myself for dinner. As we sat in an almost empty hotel's dining room, I had nothing to say. The tension held within was greater than pretending to make conversation. Another couple occupied a table not far from us, and I watched their body language as they became lost in each other's eyes, and I wished in that moment that I had felt that same euphoria. We bought a property in our hometown, a double-story house with 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a study with a built-in splash pool. Both incomes were required for the purchase of this property. I still held my full-time employment at the banking corporation on the outskirts of the township, and took turns in a carpool to use our respective held vehicles to save to each petrol expenses. Family life was stressful and full on, as I alone was attending weekly health therapy sessions with my youngest stepson, if not in consultation, then waiting for his session to finish. He suffered also with ADHD and took prescribed medication called Ritalin. Although 11 years of age, it was advised by psychologists to allow him to be properly nurtured, as this aspect of parenting had been completely void since birth, but so necessary for sense of self and belonging. I juggled between the nurturing and needs of my own biological 3-year-old and those of my stepsons, and my household duties did not falter as I stood cooking dinners most nights, helped with school projects and homework, and listened to the boys' problems. Hired to help with the more time-consuming and cleaning and washing needs was an angel, our maid, a short, plump, friendly woman in her elderly years, held to every aspect of her being only beauty. She was the pillar I leaned on. She was my comfort without understanding. She later placed my daughter firmly against her back, binding love with a blanket wrapped around her body to hold my daughter safe to continue doing her housework. She sat on my bedroom carpet cradling my daughter when I was just too exhausted to stand. There were problems at school in relation to my youngest stepson, so I was always being called to attend some or other meeting that required resolution. Again, I saw learned behaviors held to parents' actions play out in his pill and drug addictions, and in his lying and stealing, which seemed to him normal and justified, as had been portrayed in his mother's daily health lifestyle. I started to read up about Ritalin to familiarize myself with medically acclaimed prognosis and long-term disadvantages and effects. I produced a document file on the effect of Ritalin versus homeopathic remedies under guidance of a psychiatrist to start weaning my stepson off of Ritalin. That psychiatrist requested the retainment of my file. Results were validated when my stepson's teachers wanted to know how a child had transformed almost overnight. He regained his creative thinking and remained more focused during lessons to achieve higher grades. He started to feel again. He was alive, not lethargically moving through life in a blurred fog. This child I always thought was smart and highly intelligent, to be able to pull things apart and rebuild electronics that worked. He was a sensitive child with so much love in his broken heart still to be happy and helpful and want to improve himself to be a better person, to want a brighter future. Sometimes one's environment held to external persons, factors, and experiences just doesn't allow this to eventuate when lack of support allows no change. But as his confidence grew and he felt respected and properly loved in the eyes of a parent figure, deeper self-reflection allowed him to differentiate between right and wrong behaviors over many months of constant love. I had to be vigilant, respectful to his held abuses, to protect him in order also to protect my own son and later my daughter. One evening, as I was packing away clean washing, my stepson came into the bedroom and started to ruffle through my underwear. Casually, he held up one of my bras and told me that one day he was going to cut off my breasts to hang them on his wall. I did not react because I did not hear him. I did not react because I did. Raising the subject with him the following day, he had no recollection of events. Offering to run my son's bath for him also one evening, I valued my intuitive preciseness to have taught my son that if bath water was too hot, he should place his feet and hands on the sides of the bathtub to immediately lift himself from the water. My stepson had filled my son's bath with only hot water. My husband's temper became more apparent soon into the marriage, and in trying to hide his underlying instability, he pretended to be overwhelmed with responsible management workload and deadlines to hold no personal accountability for his many outbursts and physical lash-outs. The children and I had started to tiptoe around him in a nervous state, afraid to set his anger off. Sometimes nothing was needed to escalate his madness. It just was, and we were always the cause. One minute he could be calmly speaking, and the next his hands were gripped around his sons' throats to beat their heads down on the stovetop so hard, or up against walls, as he dealt with his own inner unravelling to feel a semblance of power. His physical abuse held no boundaries to how or where on our bodies he inflicted pain. Staring him down one evening, my held tears did not move in my unblinking eyes, as my disgust settled on his open arms to accept his love after he had inflicted a physical beating. Cowardly, he waited for me to be asleep to finish what he had started. Today I still struggle to fall asleep on my stomach as I begin to hyperventilate and I can't breathe. He found pleasurable satisfaction in verbal, emotional, and mental degradation, also to strip away his family bit by bit. My life distinctly held two very different realities. In one existence, within family walls, I was nothing, while the other portrayed confidence and intelligence as I liaised with stakeholders and ran the work schedule of my CEO. My husband's control escalated as I furthered my career. He prevented my self-care. I was on his time now. As I stood at his command, feeling the hot trickle of water run over my body, I felt myself flatline as he began to shave even my most private parts as he pleased. My workwear was laid out on the bed each morning as he watched me dress. I did not know how many times I could correct a broken heartbeat. To wander is today that day I die. He had started isolating me from contact with family and friends. My grocery shops were timed. I stood in a queue, panicked, and wanted to scream as I dropped my basket, running to leave the store empty-handed, rather than to face abuse. Either way, I failed. Dinner and breakfast plates were thrown across rooms to spill unsatisfactory contents as I knelt down to pick food off the floor. Cups of tea demanded were placed carefully on side tables to remain untouched and cold. I functioned on high alert and anxiousness as I tried to balance my two wills to forge some semblance of normalcy, always trying so hard to be better today and do things correctly today, to not have my independence completely crushed. His internal war became mine to bear, so imprisoned by his depressive state when he sat sobbing on the tiles of our bathroom floor to want to kill himself. Barely reaching my office, I ran to answer my ringing phone as he held a gun to his head to pull the trigger if I was not home in 15 minutes. Pushed down into the single leather chair, he continued to show his powerful victory over my entirety as a general knowledge game became solo to make deliberate beep sounds to incorrectness. Sleeping sedatives were placed in my hot drinks to have sexual intercourse with a corpse, and photographs framed me to pornographic internet sites. My daughter was the product of rape. Due to excessive stresses, my gynecologist preferred that I did not quit smoking, but rather cut down my intake to 7 cigarettes per day. An incident occurred in my seventh trimester to become more alert in heightening my vigilance as my younger stepson kicked me hard in my stomach and explaining afterwards that he was afraid I will stop loving him, so he had tried to hurt my baby. I held no anger as I sat with him alone on his bed, explaining that my love for him would always be there because it was constant and unconditional. He dedicated a song to me called One in a Million one evening when I told my stepsons to lock themselves in their bathroom for protection against their father. During these build-ups to my husband's psychotic episodes, I tried to ensure my biological son's safety to remove him from our home, to be placed for sleepovers in the care of his own biological father, or with my parents. Quickly but calmly, packing his little green train backpack, I told him also to place some books and small toys in his bag that he wished to take with him. I stood smiling, appearing strong in essence, but my heart time and again felt crushed. Feeling intuitively that my unborn child had started to go into distress due to no fetal movement, I approached my gynecologist to induce me. He was unwilling, and I was unmoving, as I stared him down and told him in clear terms that if he did not agree, I would find another gynecologist who would agree with me. The following morning I booked into the delivery unit at 7 a.m. to be induced to deliver a natural birth. I did not lay in bed like the young girl next to me who screamed in pain. I walked the corridors, and I walked through a door leading out to a little stone courtyard to watch a bird feed the little babies in her nest. I welcomed the sun on my skin and the fresh air. As the contractions came faster and became more painful, I leaned over a yoga ball on all fours on my bed and controlled my breathing. My husband's presence was fleeting, disinterested and non-committed. He had better things to do. I had been alone my whole life in so many situations and experiences, unsupported, uncared for, and unloved. As I carefully placed my feet on the cold tiles to steady myself off the bed, I walked slowly towards the bathroom to sit on the toilet, lost in my own deep thoughts, to suddenly jump at the nurse's high-pitched voice as she ran out of the room to bring help, as I had simply looked at her saying, "I need to push." Wheeled into a small equipment room, I was told there were no delivery rooms available. I lay in silence, observing my surrounds, to focus on boxes of medical equipment, to read in my mind their labels, as my gynecologist entered the small room hurriedly to deliver my beautiful daughter within minutes of entering that little equipment room. She too was not placed on my chest, but removed immediately to undergo her APGAR tests after I heard her first cry telling me she is well. I stood outside that little stone courtyard, giving thanks to God for the safe delivery of my perfectly little petite baby, as I continued to watch the progress of the little featherless babies until we were released from hospital 2 days later. My daughter's little kitten cry had me constantly running upstairs or outside, anywhere furthest from my husband's irritation that bordered always on outward explosion from his body language and tightly pulled lips. He would raise his voice and start throwing things across the room that they hit walls so hard to leave permanent indents. I was already so exhausted on all levels, I do not know how I kept putting one foot in front of the other. Being constantly knocked down led me to believe that if we, my children and I, did not get out, we would eventually become sadly just another death statistic under the Domestic Violence Act. Many events occurred for me to secretly start planning a long-awaited escape that ensured the protection of us getting out alive. I hid his safe keys, pretending not to have seen them, to prevent the use of firearms and rifles held to his safe, with boxes of bullets belonging to closed police investigations. Numerous deliberate threats reverberated from his hissing voice so close to my face that puffs of air hit my cheek. I will murder you and make it look like suicide. I removed the keys out of our home as I nervously slipped them into my father's hand and whispered, "Hide them." As his first wife and the mother of his sons climbed out of a bath, he sedated his young sons and put the volume of the television to its fullest to shoot his wife. With no witnesses and missing legal documents and statements, there was no conviction. Instead, she was labeled mentally unstable and placed from one psychiatric facility to the next for him to claim sole custody of their sons. Two drowning incidents occurred deliberately actioned by my husband's own hand. The first involved a pup my youngest stepson had brought home. If he could have saved all the animals that needed saving in the world, he would. My husband's refusal to understand or compromise that pup's welfare to even a warm little blanket had us sitting outside when he was not in our vicinity to offer quick comfort and little gentle kisses to a helpless pup, as much in the firing line as we were. I returned one afternoon from a grocery shop, my biological children in tow, to stop breathing as my stepson sat on the pool step, head in hands, sobbing, and staring down at the reflection of devastation, to be in shock to have witnessed the cold and murderous action of his father's hand pushing that little pup under water until it stopped moving. Nobody that day demanded answers, as fear gripped our insides to think who is next. It was a Saturday morning. I stirred awake to the sound of children's voices downstairs. Immediate panic hit me to rush down to keep them quiet. I moved quickly but quietly as I closed the bedroom door behind me. The previous night my husband had invited an ex-police friend and his children and current girlfriend a place to sleep before their trek back to the Transvaal. I had cooked and hosted to their every need, whilst not a single body had offered help or even for myself to sit down for a few minutes. I served my husband and his company on aching and swollen feet until their drunken state excused me to retire for the night. I must have fallen into a deep sleep almost immediately, with the comfort that my husband's good cop, good husband, good father exterior remained so to all standing outside the family circle. I stood over the stove making scrambled egg to feed the children, whose laughter sounded from the lounge room as they watched my oldest stepson trying to beat his virtual opponent on the television screen. Periodically, I urged them to keep their voices down, and although respect for the still sleeping adults was understood, it made me sad how little respect is shown to children for just being children. I had opened the sliding door to feel the morning's fresh air, to know it was to be another beautiful summer's day, as I looked up at the blue sky to see not a single cloud. I pulled on the screen door to ensure it was safely locked. My biological son was with his father that weekend. My daughter wanted to ride her little black plastic bike outside, but I coaxed her into eating her breakfast first, fearing internally that the noise of the turning plastic wheels on the stone paving would travel up to our open bedroom window. As I cleared the empty plates from the table, I looked back at my stepson, then 14 or 15 years of age, asking him to please keep an eye on his sister while I washed up. I stood watching the sink fill up with soapy suds, and suddenly lifting my head, I saw an angel telling me to run because my daughter was in danger. That guiding light showed me exactly where she was, to lead me to the exact spot, to bow down on hands and knees, to pull my drowning baby out of the water. I did not know how long she had been under water. Her lips were blue. Calmly, I gently supported her cheek in my open palm and turned her in a semi-downward position, pleased at the projectile spray now leaving her blue lips. Her little head kept flopping to lose consciousness, and still in motion, I kept blowing on her face to wake her up as I ran to call my doctor. His surgery was literally less than a 5-minute drive from our home. Passing my husband on the way up the stairs, I was not able to give thought to his strange reaction in that moment, as time was of the essence only. My doctor, a kind Indian man with a young family himself, carried out a multitude of tests, concluding my not even 2-year-old daughter a very lucky girl to have not sustained, in his opinion, any permanent injury. The only request was to keep her awake for a couple of hours and to phone him if there was any change. I did not move off our couch for the next 4 to 5 hours, as I cradled my baby in my arms and thereafter watched her sleep. I sat thinking about my husband's reaction being not a reaction or response at all, but a total disconnect, and how he had come downstairs before this all played out to demand silence as he needed to sleep. It was he who had left the security gate open to deliberately coax her outside to his false offer of the blue-purple ball, making it impossible for her to reach out and take from his hands. Instead, he threw the ball into the deep end of the splash pool and lowered her into the water to fetch it. And as she struggled to remain above water, he walked back inside and back upstairs to close himself behind closed doors. I not fully understood the injustices, nor did I understand the power held to one man's ability to destroy lives without blinking. The hamster wheel kept turning without pause. I sat at a lunch break at work feeling frustrated and on exploding point, myself, as the droning voices complained about infidelities. One secretary was crying because her husband had left her for another man, and she was devastated. Another pretended to be unable to fulfill the needs of her husband's fetishes, to hold only disgust to his openness. I sat listening in silence as I gathered my internal strength for what abuse I was to be subjected to that evening. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to hide, run. I wanted to scream. I wanted the day to only be starting, not ending. I wanted these women to understand that their problems were in fact not problems, just simply personal preferences within relations, to an individual right to live free of choice, without judgment and ridicule. Nobody was trying to hurt or murder them and their children. My husband had by this time put an end to my well-working lift club to completely remove my freedoms. His harassing showdowns outside my office building led to nervous reception staff, security guards, and managers. My embarrassment could not hide how belittled I felt, and my heart broke as he tainted the one aspect of my existence that for 8 hours a day gave me the freedom to forget how he made me feel, to be allowed to be smart and intelligent and professional and praised. Somewhere deep inside my soul broke. I fell and I could not get up. The held stress and the pain flooded through an unexpected external gateway that could not and would not shut down. I sat at my office desk sobbing. No solace was able to restore a balance. Every part of me in that instant broke down, as I was no longer capable and able to hold together my life and the lives of my children on such dangerous ground. Our human resources department immediately took action as our on-site psychologist admitted me to hospital. She remained with me to turn my husband away from my ward and out of the hospital on strict instructions to stay away from me. Her strength and determination in standing her ground to protect me that day was my silent gratitude that one person believed my story and cared enough to care. I make this very clear. I was not placed under the observation and scrutiny of a psychiatric unit. A drip was attached for immediate fluids to enter my bloodstream due to total physical exhaustion. I slept for 3 days without waking. My mother had come to the hospital on the first day for me to look her in her eyes and ask her to please care for my biological children, and that they were to go nowhere near my husband during this time. My own childhood pain, held to my core for so many years, too, had escaped from its carefully compartmentalized internal storage to spill outward. Being the better of two evils, I suppose, to want to believe abusive cycles did not continue through generations, and to hope that in a grandparent role there would be leniency to such. I had no other support structure. I lay thinking how similar threads masked grooming processes to normalize abuse. This reminded me how out of the blue my husband rushed around one late afternoon to gather camping gear, telling me he was taking the three boys camping for the night. I thought this impulsive, and my insides knotted. My son was only 4 years old. I insisted on dropping them off to have use of our vehicle. Only I told no one of my ulterior motive, to give them time to set up camp, and then to walk in, take my son by the hand, and leave. The location isolation screamed out at me as I gritted my teeth to stop the sick wave from spilling outwards. That evening I smiled down at my son as I gave him lots of little kisses all over his face to make him laugh, as I tucked him safely into his warm bed. I had little jurisdiction over my stepsons, and this made me sad, but protecting my own offspring was my first and only responsibility then, to protect their rights to a childhood free of abuses and neglect. Prior to leaving the matrimonial home, I received news that my twin and her family were to land soon on home soil for a holiday. She was to return to the UK, and her partner was to fly to Australia for a shutdown before returning home. My sister remained in a dissociative state under my parents' roof. She was angry and distant. A couple of years later, they again returned to South Africa on course to their relocation to Australia. My husband suggested willingly, and without my consultation, that my sister and her family were to have a stress-free holiday and privacy, to move into our home with the use of our vehicle, as my husband was to be away on business. It was not stipulated where myself and my children were meant to be. I pretended nothing to remain in my home with my children. My sister's husband, the father of my two nieces, seemed also to be more out of sight than not, and as it turned out there was no business away from home. This being the events that unravelled their lie to have been away. My sister and I had completed our youngest children's bath routine, and we had settled in the lounge, bringing to each child a warm bottle of milk before bedtime. My son and his cousin, my sister's oldest son, were with our parents. The front door buzzer sounded downstairs for me to carefully get up and place my daughter on my sister's lap. There was nobody there. As I closed the door and started heading back downstairs, again the buzzer went off, and again nobody was there. Confused, yet making no fuss, I offered my sister a glass of wine. The minute I took the first sip, I knew something was wrong. My tongue immediately felt numb as my airway constricted. Losing no time, we phoned the emergency poisons line, and the following morning delivered the wine to a lab for testing. Minute traces of rat poison was confirmed. As we stood still trying to comprehend the strange series of events, my shock was openly displayed at my husband's sudden appearance on the bottom of the stairs, as my breath caught in my throat. By now both children were wide awake. I knew there was trouble coming, and not showing my nervousness, I placed them on the carpet as I pushed the Barney video into the player to hear "I love you, you love me, we're a happy family," in solid hope that this distraction would save their little minds from this dysfunctional external environment they were placed in. My husband lay on the kitchen tiles, seemingly lost in agonizing tears, until I bent down beside him, for his whole body to swing over so fast onto his back as both his legs shot out to start kicking me. As fast as he moved, I moved to avoid physical contact. My senses were so heightened, again in distinct highest guidance and protection. I turned on my heels towards the staircase to the upstairs landline, telling my sister to watch the children, and my stride came to a shocking halt to realize in a split second there was no phone. Someone had removed both phones. I instructed my youngest stepson to run next door to phone my parents and an ambulance immediately. Paramedics were unable to remove my husband without his consent, and it was then that I became aware of medications he was taking for depression, as well as antipsychotics labeled to his name. I found both phones stored in the back of his cupboard, with half a bag of mothballs. The other half lay at the bottom of our splash pool. As my father stood at the front door, I remained speaking to my sister-in-law on the phone, demanding truth about her brother and their family history. I could not support what I did not know, and understandably was now ready to proceed with a divorce. As we piled into the car, my husband came storming out to tell his sons to get inside the house, as he used physical force to pull them away from the car. Between his swearing, he slowed down his words to look straight at me, to warn me against removing his sons from his care, to hit me with kidnapping proceedings. I may have held my daughter tightly in my arms as we left a landslide that night, far from over, and I suppose I felt a false sense of intermediate relief in part, but guilt lay in my thoughts as I held back my tears to not have had the courage to stand up for my stepchildren and to have been unable to protect them in that crucial moment. I felt that my protection could only go that far, to remain focused on my biological children. His apology came in the form of promising to seek professional counseling, and I stupidly believed him, placing my family back in the matrimonial home. No progression was made, and the only evident change was his transference of blame to insinuate myself mentally unstable. I waited for the calm in the eye of the storm to leave one afternoon as he headed out to run personal errands. I took my children to a safe house to think of our next move. I did this due to current legal proceedings brought to attention that my lawyer was playing both sides of the coin. I changed law firms 3 times during my 6-year battle to eventually represent myself under the guidance of one of Durban's largest law firms. All court files evidencing held statements, legal reports and findings from Child Advocate Services, medical reports and exhibits went missing. Our motion had been part heard in a lower court of law, to be abruptly stopped as I was led to a room of safety, where security guards stood at different locations to prevent my husband's open threat to shoot me. Every legal protection order I held was contravened, as corrupt law enforcement officers, barring only one, tried to arrest me in fear of themselves being brought to false legal proceedings against them by an ex-colonel. I stopped asking for help. My parents' property and vehicle was spray-painted with the word bitch, and he tried to run me off the road. He cut off my financial stream completely and removed my daughter from our private medical aid. This came to light when I was turned away from our medical practice to no longer be privately covered. In South Africa, this is a stipulation rather than a choice, to not be placed under the public health sector. It was difficult keeping employment when my estranged husband continued to harass me at various work locations, for me to be let go time and time again. I desperately placed my gold jewelry on the glass counter, asking the jeweler to give me his best price, to place food on the table while I figured out how to secure a new income stream. I wrote to the Children's Court and to media platforms for exposure to the lack of protection offered under the Child Protection Act and the removal of our basic human rights. I received no support. My children stepped out into the dark of the cool night, having been schooled by myself to walk slowly and very quietly, holding hands, to the furthest part of my parents' backyard, where my neighbors, also my close friends, had made a hole in the fence for my children to disappear to a safe place whenever orders were contravened. A little mattress was placed on the carpet next to their bed, as they lovingly protected my children too many times than I wish to remember. My 6-year-old son, too many times, slept with his baseball bat under his bed. Too many times he fled to his dad to protect him. One evening I was caught off guard, not expecting to see my husband after we had parted ways just that afternoon in court, to immediately close the sliding door behind me, telling my mother to take my children to the back room. I stood alone on the driveway, watching my husband's running motion towards me to instinctively protect my head from his physical blow. I don't know why I did that night, shout as loud as I could the name of my friend next door. I was so tired of it all. As his hand lay claim to my shoulder, he whispered, "My eyes will be the last thing you see before you die." I sat alone in the dark on the stoop that night, with the absolute knowing that we would never come out alive. I did not sob. I listened to a song by Celine Dion and Josh Groban called The Prayer, and the following day I walked into an illegal firearms shop in a black township to request a firearm with only one bullet. Some may say illogical thinking had overpowered me, or even temporary insanity. I told no one my plan to lure my husband onto the property, to kill him before he killed us, to at least afford my children a future. Only rifles were available. I did not know how to use a rifle. I walked out feeling hopeless. Poor decisions were made by government child protection services, who focused more on parental placement than on the best interest of a child, to conclude day and overnight grants to a father so abusive. This clause was later removed to hold in its place supervised visitation rights in findings of suspected child molestation. Once a happy, bubbly little baby, and the most beautiful and funny little girl in the world, her right to a childhood free of abuses was taken before the age of 5, because no authorities listened to what I told them. This is negligent and unacceptable practice. Camera footage showed a little girl's body stiffen as she pulled my arms tighter around her for protection when her father entered the waiting room. I begged you all for justice, but instead injustice spoke louder. I state also loud and clear to a specific non-government organization affiliated to a cause for fathers' rights: you caused more damage than greatness to play so recklessly with children's futures. Please stand down from hurting other families the way you hurt mine, because while you play with lives, it is myself and my son who remember the day a little girl died. Even with supervised visits, she hid under beds or in preschool playgrounds, holding tightly onto teachers' or assigned psychologists' necks, to want only to remain in their arms. 2 separate psychometric tests were carried out at the request of the child advocate to each parent and to my daughter. Findings concluded myself and my daughter free of any mental disorders. My husband, however, was advised to seek psychiatric help. At the time, trying to cope made breaking down impossible, in fear that I may never get up. So although little appreciation may have been outwardly shown at the time, my absolute gratitude and deep appreciation, so soul deep, for both my parents and Oma Bubbles, my children's daycare mother, and her family. I thank you for allowing me to lean into you more than you realized, to trust wholeheartedly the safety of my baby girl in your hands and in your hearts. I stood outside the High Court looking up at the writing engraved in its structure, and I silently prayed for justice to prevail before walking up the stairs to enter the building. And I wondered how man-held justices were decided by one mere mortal, ultimately holding the power to change a person's life forever on factual evidence. As I stood looking at the roll call outside the court, the advocate whom had placed 2 thick files in my arms to school me for this one chance, voiced in surprise that the preceding judge, an elderly Jewish man, had in fact retired from his duties, but had been called back for one last judgment. Addressing his last question to me, I looked straight into his soul and answered, "My lord, he can take everything. I ask only for our freedom." And so our relocation to Australia was set in motion. As difficult as it is to place into existence that a mafia family heard my story through a young man's interest to make a difference, he sat listening with tears in his eyes, the drama-filled reality of our existence. He had lost his parents at a young age and was placed in his aunt's care to be introduced into the secret world of mafia. It was only on my return that day from court that he strolled up the driveway to hug me, to tell me what he was able to reveal. He had met her over dinner to explain my storyline, for us to be secretly protected under surveillance. Stately black vehicles patrolled our road and the vicinity to know we are being watched. As I was about to close the door, literally on our lives, the landline phone rang, and my heart stopped at the receiving voice of my husband telling me that we will not leave South Africa alive. I placed the receiver on the hook and running to the car, I told my father to drive. Chapter 7: Bleeding Hearts. I had disclosed no true departure dates to a single person. It was only after we shuffled our way through international passport control that I phoned my sister to relay our correct flight details. We felt a nervous tension mixed with apprehension and excitement as we tilted backward, pushed firmly into our assigned portals to become airborne. It was then, once we were safe in space and the blue sky, that I almost whispered to my children, then 7 and 11, our next plan of action, holding in the back of my mind that we may be so close to freedom, yet also there was still that possibility of sadly leaving this world a death statistic under the domestic violence culmination of gathered and inputted data statistics. I had been told that the mafia would protect our safety out of South Africa. I had been told that undercover security would stand disguised as passengers or bystanders to ensure we remained alive. I had been told that I would look into the eyes of the young man's aunt, whose name never could be revealed, for her personal observation and witness to our walk to freedom. As I looked from one child to the other, I told them that as soon as we landed down, we had to walk very fast, even run, and that they were not to release their grip of our holding hands at any time, that we would be able to rest soon, and that we would order burger meals. I told them also that we would share our love with their cousins, because we had lots of love to give, and it was always the kindest thing to do, and they had a beautiful Christmas celebration only 4 days away to look forward to. The year was 2007. Prior to our final departure, I alone had sat on 2 long and tedious flights to aid my sister's family in crisis situations. The first came about to receive a phone call from my sister to understand that she had had some or other breakdown. My mother felt it best for me to fly across the globe to help, stating that as her twin, I understood her best. I arrived in Sydney on the Easter long weekend, met by my brother-in-law's welcoming smile. They lived in a suburb approximately an hour south of Sydney, in a private rental property consisting of 4 bedrooms held to a double-story structure with an adequate fenced backyard and a large in-ground swimming pool and storage shed. As we pulled into the driveway, my sister appeared on the front veranda, smiling broadly as her almost 1-year-old daughter balanced on her hip. The other 3 children ran to the parked car, excited to greet me. The oldest of my nephews held tears unreleased that told me all was not well behind his smile. Quickly hugging the younger of the boys, who reminded me in so many special ways of my own biological son, to hold a deep soul connection that often required little words, I bent down to finally meet my 4-year-old niece, and picking her up into my arms, I started to walk towards my sister to hug her tightly. Immediately she placed her daughter in my arms. Greetings over, we all walked into the house to watch the children running, then stopping and taking off again as they eagerly looked for eggs hidden in the back garden. I felt overwhelmed as I stood thinking of my own 2 children, and I wondered to myself, were they missing me in this moment too? It had become apparent to me in those 3 weeks that a visible lack of solidarity in parental bonds had destabilized family roots. One parent was overpowering, and the other, by choice, wanted nothing to do with anything family-related. My sister, all for our initial greeting, had beyond my reasoning shut down and shut me out completely, after she assumed we were paddling in the same sinking boat to the crushing waves of childhood abuses that was reflecting in her personal and present circumstances. She seemed to want to spend time away from family responsibilities, if not locking herself behind closed doors, then leaving the children at home to go shopping. She seemed to me to disappear into a silent anger, even a hatred, to appear more like a tag-along instead of holding her place at the center of her family, and to show more annoyance than happiness during beach or family outings. My own observations failed to understand the precise urgency to have been pulled from my own life and children to watch two grown adults unable to capacitate and resolve their own private and personal affairs. I myself was carrying my own burdens and ongoing stresses, of which I not spoke, to be still then in the middle of a lengthy divorce battle, carrying death threats. I returned home for precisely 1 month to find myself again in mid-air to assist my sister's family. We had just finished dinner one evening when I looked at my father and told him my sister is in trouble. The telephone rang and it was my brother-in-law to confirm my sister had been admitted to hospital under the care of mental health. My mother again told me I have to go help my sister. She thought the timing was perfect, as my employer sister company had folded, forcing retrenchments, this being a company who had headhunted me to jump ship for double the salary. My mother's authority overruled my right to my own life, free of my sister's. I felt pulled in so many directions. My proposed 3 month stay in Australia was shortened when I received notification of a court date for deliverance and hopeful closure. I had so little time to prepare as I continued to run, and as I picked up my sister's burdens, South Africa was literally burning in anger riots. Schools became unsafe and children became homeschooled. I spoke regularly to my children to hear their voices and to hear about their days, to say good night to them and to tell them I love them. One night they both were elated because their Opa brought home the cutest little puppy that fitted in their hand, and her name was Lady. I smiled through my tears, in sorrow for not being physically present, and in humbleness that my parents respectively had made the effort to be wonderful and amazing grandparents to my children in small and big ways. I immediately landed running, as I was taken to see my sister in hospital and given the lay of the land by my brother-in-law, to act as a single parent, to fall into a day-to-day routine and structure without guidance even to where the children's schools were located. I felt out of my depths to care to the needs of two toddlers still in diapers, imminently afraid I would not hear or awake to their cries at night, being that they were not biologically bonded to me. The first day I used the vehicle assigned to me, I was stopped by the police for an expired registration to spend my morning walking to the train station where my brother-in-law had parked his car to catch the train to college. I needed a car to collect the children from school. There was little order in this home, and quite frankly, all I saw was different rules and leniencies held to disciplines and punishments unequal across the family holding. I was advised by immigration to return to South Africa to bring my children into Australia and apply on shore for a permanent carer visa. This information too formed part of my representation in the High Court of South Africa. Finally, here we were in a first world country called the land of milk and honey. My children both were placed in their respective age-appropriate grades on application. However, this was restructured to place them in higher grades due to their former curriculum surpassing Australia's education system. A school day in South Africa started at 7:30 a.m. to finish around 2:30 p.m. to then participate in extramural compulsory activities held on the school grounds before heading home to complete assigned homework held to most subjects. I remember sitting for hours with my children from grade 1 to have already then been assigned reading sums, writing homework, block, then cursive, to at times console them through their tired minds and crocodile tears. Australian schools seemed to place more emphasis on buddy systems rather than respect of authority to teachers and leaders, and my absolute astonishment came at year end when all children passed a respective year with no proper nor accurate theory or practical testing technique to validate understanding of knowledge taught. There was no percentage formula to distinguish failure from success to move to the next grade with satisfactory results. In South Africa, there was a clear establishment that if one's final set of exams did not surpass a 50% pass rate, or if one failed a language, they were to redo that year. Again, I formed a strict routine to cope with children ranging from 1 to 13 in age, to successfully manage a busy lifestyle, to divide my attentions as equally as it allowed with 2 toddlers. My brother-in-law was completing an electrical apprenticeship, so while he secured his future, I carried his children's lives on my back. I was falling down a rabbit hole to be so sadly and suddenly placed in my sister's life, caring for her children and becoming full-time guardian more as an expectation than a request. Looking at their furnishings and their photo frames, holding their family in place, I felt like I had been placed, as if in a dream, in someone else's life, and it did not feel real. I was on duty 7 days a week, entertaining and carting children everywhere. I sat at sports clubs feeding 2 little girls in their car seats. I washed hair, cut nails and changed diapers and washed clothes and did grocery shops and paid rent and utilities. I sat with homework and projects and met with teachers to build a strong rapport to stay on top of difficulties and achievements. I took the babies to birthday parties. I watched them play in parks and fed the ducks and the eels and picked daisies to put in their hair when we went for walks. I laid out 6 lunch boxes to pack school lunches ready for the next morning. I took them to the hospital to visit their mother. I met with psychologists and psychiatrists to ascertain forward movement and support needs. I tucked the children in at night and I disciplined them. I forgot to collect 2 of the children from a library's free arts and crafts class, and it was I who encouraged gymnastics and ballet classes. I lost my health insurance policies in South Africa, and I lost my dreams to want to be more than a free maid and carer. For 4 years, I worked tirelessly to receive no income and not even one day off in gratitude or thanks. What my children and I received were further abuses and injustices held to our lives, not realizing fully the connection of an abusive cult through male counterparts, affiliations being stronger than my belief of in-law acquaintances. Chapter 8. Falling. Most vigilant in my care role, I tried to learn exact point of no return. I watched mannerisms, body language, speech tone, eye focus, behavior patterns, triggers and interactions to identify space of time held to safe passage in relation to patient and family members without loss of dignity. If it meant to leave a school concert midway for sedation, or to shorten a mother-child interaction, I tried always to do so in a nonchalant manner. My twin has held many spectrums to my world, in emotional failings and huge comebacks. To place exactness to isolate each emotion to its own depth and value is impossible, as dark and light feed off each other in most intricate, intertwining fortitudes. Where there is hopelessness, there also is hope, and in destruction a newness is cultivated. Nothing is ever lost because everything is connected, following its own path of wisdom and healing. A very special psychologist once said nothing lasts forever, and in essence the only constant is change. I was carrying my own trauma to understand the sensitivity of falling beyond any pain threshold, as personal fear became mine to carry secretly. As I sat in support of my twin in psychology and psychiatry sessions, afraid that I too may fall, my protection of my twin became questionable to having tried as a little girl to protect her from ongoing ritualistic abuses. The question also was, had I seen but not had the capacity to protect? Part of me held a silent anger to almost beg in unspoken terms. I promised to shut the door and throw away the key. Please turn around, little girl, and walk away. This was not possible. Looking back, perhaps a great deal of confusion developed on a psychological level to almost want to obliterate the other out of existence, to be to each other only a constant reminder of pain and betrayal. Yet the heart feels what the heart feels. We didn't comprehend how we were each other's main trigger, not failing to recognize how parents had simulated a barbaric spectatorship, honing in on one a gladiator appraising and the other a traitor. Taking no credit to a calm exposure, combatant synergies emerged in stillness and shock as I stood in the bathroom doorway, interpreting the bloodied artwork on my sister's legs, as she too continued to look down at her piece of art so perfectly sculptured by a sharp blade, to release its red paint still running down her legs. My words bounced off closed walls to know no words held relevance as I wrapped a damp towel around her pain that was just too much to bear. The only request was for her to give me a signal if there were blood-stained clothes or sheets for my immediate removal and washing in a conspicuous manner from the children's knowing. Sometimes sharp knives and glassware disappeared to bring jagged open wounds, validating immediately how important a process self-harm becomes when a bird has lost its wings. I added blades to my regular shopping list and hid them in a place high up for only my sister to find. Stringent protection knew to leave the babies in the locked car, to walk quickly through the house, always in fear that an emergency call would be made today. Harrowing recollections remain in memory forever, as family and caring demands outweighed the hours in a day. Peg in hand dropped to hit the ground as the Seroquel ingestion started to take effect, as she lost her balance in a slow-motion shuffle, sliding her feet along the paving, unable to lift her feet. My mind raced with the knowing that I had left her sleeping for only a few minutes to hang out the washing. Taking most of her weight, I told her to lean into me as we struggled back indoors. Unfamiliar at that time to the dangers of forced Seroquel vomiting, I encouraged her to get sick. I spoke gently, placing only emphasis on the main extremities rather than on mental health, coaxing an emergency visit to feel, but not show, my rising panic, to know we were running out of time as she kept repeating, "No ambulance." My foot remained down on the pedal as I steered with one hand, the other held her limp head to almost periodically bounce it like a ball in my open hand to keep jolting her awake. Before I had even switched off the car engine, my door was open and I was screaming for help. A doctor immediately started the charcoal process and drips were attached to veins, stabilizing my life, before transference to a main hospital resuscitation unit for 2 days. I was transported to a room for interrogation. Painfully, I watched as leg cramps beguiled a failed suicide attempt, as a little girl floundered in a confusion to feel sick but still want to play, as she whispered in my ear, "You and me, let's run away from the doctors," as she tried to get off the bed, seeming too high for her little self. Less than a week later, severe agitation presented to danger point despite administering additional medication. Anger rose as she told me to get out of her way of death. I stood unblinking, as I would in the future with my daughter, and said, "Not on my watch." All she wanted was for somebody to respect and acknowledge her deeply held pain, not to craziness and mental labels, but to a childhood that's betrayal was so perpetual, a little girl stayed in hiding under the hood. I requested a private room as onlookers stared at a real-life performance of exactly what dissociative disorder looks like. There were children and babies, and I didn't want them to be afraid. Triage led us out of the emergency room in respect of my notion. Like a caged animal, she began to pace inside her own prison more fiercely. Fear grew inside me as I stepped immediately out of her personal space to stand a few feet away, closest to the open door, but still facing my sister. The shrill that left her wounded soul forever will ring in my ears, bore witness to what bleeding hearts must sound like in vibration. Medical bodies came running as I stumbled backward into the passage and slid down the wall, sobbing, to hear her voice shouting, "I know this case, I've got it." Climbing forlorn onto the narrow sponge bench, my shock was the greater to realize the entire room was encompassed in sponge as I stood alongside a security guard asking if I'm all right. Her brokenness in surrender had brought tears to my eyes, and my throat burned to swallow back my humorous thought that she had, in that saddest way, reminded me of Fievel from An American Tail. The stresses became so overwhelming that at times I burst out laughing when my sister asked if I would like to hold her baby son as she handed me the dog in her arms, or when she brought a sandwich to an empty chair or woke me from sleep to get out of her bed. I did wonder if she had the ableness to harm or even kill me. I brought hours of soothing to her shattered mind, to gently stroke her hair and tickle her back, to know that I was saying a prayer for her and loving her tonight. My degree of applause and humbleness to my twins' devotion and determination to fail nothing in failing meant to rise so strong in her children's eyes. She worked so tremendously hard to be in intensive therapy more than once every week for years. She complied with homework tasks and kept a diary, and then many. No matter that pages became blood smeared and others held holes from black, hateful scribbles. She wrote, she screamed, she cried, and gave up. She got back up and trialled pull combinations under re-evaluation. She sunk and rose, but even in a dissociative state, she sat in therapy saying, I'm here because I want to get better. I bring only the highest respects and thanks to my sister's psychologist and psychiatrist, because without their ongoing support and guidance, even after hours, to have gone above and beyond, they deserve a humanitarian praise. They stood so high in integrity and oath to make this world a better place because they cared. Chapter 9 Blue Blue Sky. Late August of 2011, my son's father called me specific to a dangerous operation he was to undergo. We spoke regularly and we had remained good friends. He had moved to the United Kingdom after our divorce to be offered a better, more independent lifestyle under the NHS. I remember how I nervously sent our son alone on his first international flight at age 8 or 9. I had so wished that my ex-husband was able to visit us in Australia to see the children's lifestyle, but this was not possible. I wanted few regrets. I already held so many that no time could turn back to right wrongs. It was important for them to be together, if not one last time. Focused not on the sadness of the reality of another future loss, but instead that memories would live on, I made the final decision to move to England with my biological children. During our ancestral visa process, our Australian permanent visas were granted. I had become harder in character, and with the knowledge that my daughter's father easily and freely had entry to the United Kingdom, I took my chances. As I laid eyes on him, tears filled my eyes. Happy tears, sad tears, regret, compassion, love. My heart, after all this time, held still so much deep love for this man. Our connection had held somehow an unbreakable thread of respected hardship, one that held its own language when we looked at each other. Our living arrangement altered between ex-in-laws and ex-husband. The children were immediately registered into their new school, and I obtained employment to quickly fall into a new routine, a new life. I in fact held down 3 jobs simultaneously, and the children were able to walk the short distance to and fro every day. Our son had played rugby and wished to continue this sport, so he joined the local sports club. It made me so happy to see my ex happy and partaking again a physical stance in our son's existence. He and his wonderful live-in carer helped the children with homework and welcomed their new friends openly. I think we were truly happy. I was truly happy to hold no fear, ever, to our co-parenting abilities with the absoluteness of proper care, discipline, and unconditional love. Not once did I depend on others to pay our way. Almost immediately I purchased a used car, and holding a mirror up to his face, I showed him the new purchase outside his bedroom window excitedly. However, gross advantage was taken as my ex-mother-in-law, already receiving the child support payment, requested a rental amount so astronomically high that I was not able to establish us to our own rental property for the whole duration we were in England. She monopolized on my inability, even with 3 incomes, to pass the eligibility threshold held to an automated private rental affordability system. Irrespective of this hurdle, I felt like a normal person for the first time in 4 years, able to place my focus solely on my own children and life. I could spoil them a little and take them on outings. We visited Madame Tussauds, and we paid our respects as we stood in the crowd with the rest of London on the Queen's birthday to celebrate Her Majesty and the Queen Mother. I no longer had to split myself in 10 million directions, and it felt great. I was enormously grateful and honored as I stood in the company and support of someone I loved so dearly, hearing him shout from the sideline. We had laughed as I struggled to push the wheelchair through the soft, muddy patches on the field, for him to be up close and personal as his son played rugby. I will always remember how I felt that day as he shouted encouragement and praises and offered fatherly advice at half-time. I stood again wishing that things had been different for our family. I too, that day and many other days, was so appreciative of a living carer who remained just a step behind, to allow a family that precious togetherness without outside intrusion. If you are reading this, I thank you dearly for everything you were and everything you are, from your beautiful smile to your patience and understanding. Thank you for allowing us to intrude on your life and schedule. Our loss was just as much yours. I hope you have found your healing and that you have continued to travel and see wonderful places. My personal media accounts again became hacked and communications held relevance to having a hitman out on us. But even in that moment, my realization did not fully comprehend the intimate connection between the two men holding its full purpose to my downfall. Did my brother-in-law not understand that he was placing us further in danger? Again I began to live looking over my shoulder, and I thought perhaps it was best to give up the fight. I wanted to scream and never stop. I said nothing to anyone in fear that if I spoke out, another life was endangered or gone. My ex-mother-in-law treated us so badly. Her behavior was disgraceful as she blatantly refused to greet us and excluded my daughter and I from family gatherings. Everyday existence became more hateful as deliberate attacks were placed on us to the point that my poor ex-father-in-law was forbidden to speak to us. I think this confused the children and it made them sad. Happy to have made a life in England, I eventually threw in the towel with this unspoken knowing that no true and fair support system was ever to be had, and that I was sadly just in everybody's way. I made no attempt to pretend not to drink alcohol, as I placed more scrutiny on my family lineage proportional to ancestral past and present timelines. Instead of open communications and the belief of lies from others, my ex-husband degraded me and my level of responsibility, yet I had run alone every day and for so many years, making important decisions to benefit more people in more ways than was ever stated. I kissed the last goodbye as I divulged our son's stolen funds. He cried, my ex-husband, and asked me to leave. I left his home, and we left England. I was sorry that his mother still was the higher force in his life. Trying to settle for no other reason than desperately needing support, however little, however wrong, however abusive, I asked my brother-in-law to marry me in a hurting and so terribly alone moment of speech. I wanted so much to feel I belonged for reasons other than catching falling stars. Had I become so codependent without seeing it? Was I just a laughing stock? Just a great root, but nothing more and nothing less? Or ultimately, maybe I was nothing at all. I was so tired of looking over my shoulder, so tired of running on empty, so tired of every lie and every injustice that swirled and circulated with no exit point and no finalization of peace. It had to be me doing something wrong. I was missing something of great importance to have tried so hard to break generational cycles and lack and victim mentalities, to only always end up where I'd started, having made no difference at all. Every person in my life had in some form brought an abusive and intrusive element to the connection and to my genuine kindness and honest transparency. A family-related couple interrupted my thoughts one evening after my return from a 12-hour shift, as I stood looking up at the night skies having a cigarette, to be the suggestion of a threesome. My ex-father-in-law, in a drunk state, however perceived, tried also to kiss me in a public setting, for me to understand the sadness in his eyes. I had sat with him when nobody else would. We watched cricket and horse races together, and I listened to him as he poured out his life and his held regrets. I had witnessed his dismissal on so many levels from a wife who made him feel so unloved in an unwanted and unimportant way that broke a man's spirit. I understood the exactness to a yearning unfound. We returned to Australia to find out my brother-in-law was in the process of buying a property. We continued where we had left off in our sexual loveless interlude, uninhibited and without reserve, but my heart and soul continued to yearn for something real that seemed always unavailable and unattainable. Also yearning deeply for self-respect and respect from others, this ultimately had to start with me. So I made a decision to cut ties, abstaining from all sex acts and pleasures. I cut him completely out of my life, leaving only a communication line open to see my nieces, and I took over his rental property. He began to stalk us and told me he is watching our every move. He disclosed that a private investigator was building a case to have my daughter and I removed from Australia and deported back to South Africa. He claimed child support for my son at 17. Why did child support services allow this injustice? And what rights did he have to a child not affiliated to him on any legal grounds? 22nd September 2013, my world came crashing down when a loss of the greatest magnitude became so personal and soul-crushing when my 17-year-old son lost his father. It was a Sunday afternoon when a nagging sensation told me to phone my son to feel that something was wrong. He had been helping fix up the new house. I heard my niece's father prompting my son's conversation, and this annoyed me, as my son asked if I'd heard from his dad because his laptop was broken. And as I placed the phone on the hook, I stood still thinking that something felt odd. I jumped as the telephone rang, and still in thought about my son, I said, "Hello." My niece's father was informing me that my son's father had passed away that day. I heard myself break as the phone fell from my hand, and I fell to my knees sobbing. I wanted to scream, "Why?" I wanted to hold my husband in my arms and hear his voice one last time. It was not until that exact moment that I experienced the split and break of one parenting soul in two bodies. To have had always same cause in love for a son and a daughter. In that moment of surrender, down on my knees, I understood aloneness and the final breaking of my soul. I needed to see my son. I needed to make arrangements for father and son to say goodbye, to lay their final respects in the dust. I did not overwhelm him with hugs and tears and I'm sorries as I stood silently in the doorway to hear his plea, "Mom, just get me to England to say goodbye to Dad." And so I did. I made 3 trips to Canberra that week for emergency documentation due to a current passport renewal process in progress. I paid his airfare through an advanced government payment. I stood patiently as he chose a suit from a store's discounted rack, and heading back to the car, I pulled his new suitcase behind him and me in silence. I gave him cash to rely on no one, and I spoke to school heads for the allowance of leniencies in his upcoming final exams. I was appalled when his grandmother said his presence was not expected. I shot back vehemently that son and father needed closure. I begged his family not to release his body for burial until his son had arrived in England. And understanding my son well, I knew to step back for him to heal in his time and readiness. I thought our places cross and recross plateaus held to one timeline. I had driven every day to Banbury to my office job, not once laying eyes on a graveyard. As I mourned privately, I lit a candle in thanks and love. Old school friends held a vigil on a local beach, and as they released lanterns, I released anger. Did they not know that his favorite song was by Alphaville, Forever Young? I became sensitive and tearful and defensive and protective. 2 butterflies appeared in my daughter's bedroom and remained with her for 7 days before disappearing. She told me he was with her. I woke from sleep to see him in the passage as he stood in a pure light cylindrical prism. I smiled as I mouthed his name out loud and whispered, "I love you," before laying my head back down to sleep. A canvas print of London shifted on the wall, and a glass shattered into shards in my daughter's hand to look more like crystal nuggets laying on the kitchen floor. He came to me in my dreams and held out his laptop for me to take as he said, "Now I run with the wind." As I drove out of my unit block one evening, the brakes hit the floor as he lay on his back between two parked cars, his head turned towards me. He was blanketed in white. I wondered if my mind was playing tricks, and yet I felt him strongly. The following morning, as I searched for something in a kitchen cupboard, my eyes settled on our book, Chicken Soup for a Woman's Soul, and as I held it, I allowed my tears to flow freely in remembrance. I opened it to read his message of hope that read, Van, I hope this helps you in a time of need. It has taken years of healing to release him. A day has not gone by where I have not ached for him. My son too has cried openly and privately. To understand his saddest realization came to receive a responsibility beyond his 17 years, to place to the living a pecking order of presumable importance, tangible items held in a man's absence he wished so dearly was still here. I do not know details held to last will requests, but what I do know is that my son opened opportunities for others in a solid humanitarian act of selflessness, and what I do know is that he wished only for two of his father's items that were denied. A considerable amount of monies went to my ex-mother-in-law and my niece's father. My son cried in apology to me. I did not understand, because I was so proud of him to have shown in his actions the level of understanding that no man's value can be measured by worldly wealth alone. And continuum adorned its richness over me, because it was my smile that lit up to hear a husband's laugh in a son's laugh, and looking into the window of his soul, there lay also a husband and a father for eternity. I sat quietly listening to my son's healing as he told me the ventilator was switched off for a father to hear his son say, I love you. Chapter 10, Red Tape. Looking directly at the attractive Mara agent, I listened with intent to what she was advising, as I watched her body language from across the desk where she sat. I sat unmoving in support of her client, my sister. Our request had been a simple renewal of a New Zealand spousal visa 461. I myself had lodged this same paperwork 4 years prior without complication and a positive outcome. As I looked at a building across the street through the sun-filled window, my focus remained on her energies, and I saw an image of bodies associated with payment under the table. A conflict of interest in legal standings had already emerged, as my niece's father had appointed this very firm to finalize their divorce that held to its finalization unfair custodian parenting plans. The power of money abused is one of the worst crimes held to unjust dealings, to be in a position to win at all costs, to bring to the foreground another's weakness, to avoid scrutiny of one's own irrationality and mental instabilities. This same lawyer had brought a positive result to my ministerial intervention application, far more complex than a temporary visa renewal. I knew there was leeway on submission timeframes, so to my mind and knowledge there was no reason for complication in this matter, unless deliberate intent to withhold submission within its allocated timeframe became that payment under the table. A 28-day notice issue sadly removed my sister from Australia and from her family. Further illegal practices came to light in relation to fraudulent alterations to government letterheads held to email correspondence on my personal email account, also hacked, where a closure request was received by immigration for client to forego the continuation of the visa process, instructing final closure of this active application. In the face of gross misconduct and unjust legal procedures, my sister lost her basic human right to remain in Australia within her family unit, and she lost her right to motherhood. No matter what a mother looks like, she will always remain the greatest, most integral part of a child's development and existence. Even when loss is experienced between a mother and child, etheric cords can seldom be severed. In essence, a family's God-given right to remain united was taken without regard and apology. Still under investigation, obliterating evidence to find reason for myself and my daughter to be removed, were the findings of a private investigator to have lost more on premeditated accusatory statements made against me than factual evidence uploading such statement. demonstrating lack of compassion to his biological daughters still so young. No sympathy nor empathy was brought to their mental and emotional turmoil to soon be losing their mother. He in fact divulged openly his wish for the plane, with specific referencing to a recent news report to be lost at sea, taking her carer with her. Upheaval again rocked our stability, for a betterment of a word, as we started to sell furniture and advertise for good homes for our two little dogs, Cuddles and Casper. My sister's mental state failed to stand alone, as she, like her children, understandably fell apart. Bags packed and a quick cash sale for the car sold way below market value, we left Australia to accompany my sister to East Sussex little fishing town called Hastings. The original plan was for my daughter and myself only to remain for a duration of 6 weeks to support my sister's transition. We remained in Hastings for almost a year, to return to Australia after my hands again were tied by Children's Services, threatening to remove my 15-year-old daughter from my care if I continued to hold employment. An evening home visit resulted in my shouting and swearing at crisis support workers and police officers to get out of my house, as I sarcastically applauded their support structure and guidance as a far better option than a regular income stream to be sitting under a bridge homeless. I threw my hands in the air, utterly frustrated and deeply angered to be liable for so much in the family dynamic, carrying continual ongoing stresses and demands and emergencies, to always have to be in so many places at the same time, splitting myself where every direction and situation held its own spectrum of urgency. Both sister and daughter, again, were hospitalized, separately and simultaneous, but now the additional stress was that my sister's physical body was beginning to shut down. I was left feeling torn, because I knew that I was being unfair to my daughter, to destabilize her security through this constant flow of change that held so little moving room. Having my back against the wall broke down the cliché so often heard in ignorance that you always have a choice. No, you don't always have a choice. Sometimes there just is no choice, as you keep the ones you love going on a wheel that just keeps spinning until it spins out of control. Less than 2 weeks into our English lifestyle, my daughter tried to take her life and was sectioned to a psychiatric unit in Ticehurst for a duration of 4 months, where her sudden release without diagnosis unduly covered up an investigation that was being conducted for claims made by patients in relation to improper sexual behaviors by male nurses. After my daughter turned 18, she confirmed such, refusing to press charges. Our return to Australia, although by default, in hindsight, brought a level of calm back to our environment. I had almost had enough of everything and everyone who had such little respect for my family of three, and my dreams now lost. With a mental health plan back in place, my daughter's support needs were being met best they could, with reluctancy to deliver past abuses held to manipulation. October 2016 to August 2019, I found a safe haven, a place of belonging where I started again to breathe and feel hopeful. A very special family saw me through my hard exterior, and they brought rhythm back to my heart that will beat in unconditional love and a prayer of thanks always to its original three who brought so much positive change to my journey on planet Earth. A very special lady mentored me in the Leo sun under the Leo moon, while a crab's hard shell gave me a run for my soul, and a wagging tail's howl honored the moon and the stars and the blue, blue sky, to remember a place we called home. I still hear a lady's voice in my head when I have no more courage and strength to stand, to tell me to dust myself off and to march forward. Leading up to a life-changing event in February of 2018, a black bird approached me as I stood in a place that had not seen a bird even on its fence line. It stood at arm's length as I slowly bent down and asked what God's message was. The black bird tilted its head to one side, not losing eye contact, before it turned to walk away. It disappeared, as if never there. It did not take flight or disappear through foliage. It simply vanished like a mirage. My first thought was that I was to bury my daughter in the near future. Sitting alone outside, I lifted my head to the blue, blue sky to see an image of a chariot being pulled by a soul I recognized as a family pet in the form of a dog. Angels directed the chariot from behind as angelic light surrounded the image. Tears wet my cheeks as a gentle downward stream followed its own course of release. A deep and emotional knowing I could not speak of filled my energy field as Archangel Michael's golden light comforted me. I refused to sit in acceptance, for taking my daughter would mean taking me. I begged God, take my life if it means giving my daughter life. So many hopeless moments brought tears to her plea to not know how to live, but to not want to die. She had been on small doses of two medications prescribed by a certified psychiatrist and managed, respective to follow-up appointments and repeat scripts by our general practitioner, namely Luvox and Seroquel. However, additional prescribed medication, highly addictive in its elemental constituent, triggered more depressive states to alter its performance, almost daily suicide ideation. I made inquiries with a reputable organization that qualified in retreat programs held to addictions and mental health correlation. Unable to afford it, partly due to its location in Bali, my daughter alone started the painful process of weaning herself off the opiate. Heartbroken, I watched her roll on the carpet in agony as hot sweats opened her pores, and bowls of vomit were flushed and replaced empty next to her. I witnessed more strength in deliverance held to her tiny frame. To watch my daughter hold the power of change in her hands. To endure such a process had to mean enough and no more. She lessened her regular daily intake to half and then quarterly tablets to want to be free of all medications. On the weekend of her worst suicide attempt, her nephew's sudden appearance at the front door surprised us. But as always, we were so happy to see him, her carpenter twin, we called them. She was in good spirits until late afternoon, when her state sadly dropped. She presented as agitated and withdrew to her bedroom. Instinctively, I prepared for an emergency crisis as I controlled my own breathing and inconspicuously started to hide sharps. I knew that my daughter's repeat script had not yet been collected, so I held little concern to a pill overdose. During my carer mother role, there were times when I felt compelled to remove the right to her self-administering of medications, to hold under lock and key a bought petty cash box. Self-blame and guilt becomes every carer's internal questioning of doubt and incompetence, to relive, rethink, and restructure more attainable, solid prevention methods, to avoid being placed under direct interrogation held automatically to the minds of mental health practitioners and emergency departments as negligence. Instead of pointing fingers at those very carers who at times work around the clock with no respite for years and no proper training in this broad and complex field, I wish some focus was placed on humanitarian respects. Often carers become so drained keeping their loved ones alive through deliberate restriction to avoid death on their watch. So in reality, we stand and block another's rite of passage held to their own choices. Morals become skewed as karmic and codependent bonds manipulate one's entirety. I'm not sure if any codes were called that night as paramedics made their own silent observations to ascertain ingestion quantity from the vomited contents still in the stainless bowl. Gloved hands gathered up empty pill sleeves, too many to my quick calculation in my head. I had already started to hold space as she repeated, "I'm sorry and I love you." Taking her hand, I reassured her everything will be all right. Wheeled into the closest emergency department, paramedics handed over their call out to the on-duty night staff. The gurney on which my daughter lay remained locked in place where they had left her in the entrance foyer. I stood as if stuck in quicksand between a loved one and the guards who could save her. Confusion engulfed me as I looked from the group of nurses casually huddled together laughing in conversation, holding no sense of urgency, and back to my daughter who lay peacefully and unresponsive to her surroundings. Eyes closed, her cheeks had begun to sink in, and her skin was discoloring. Again I turned my head to the laughing nurses, and back to my daughter, as I asked Archangel Michael to protect this moment in strength and in God's will only. Specialists should have notified me of my daughter's cardiac arrest. Perhaps negligence held to underpaid, understaffed, undervalued certified nurses and doctors excused liabilities held in error to simply state that she should have presented in a body bag. I looked at them one by one, shook my head in thanks, and walked out with the absolute knowing that my daughter was not immediately placed under emergency observation, nor was there a single body under oath who had cared about her life in that monumental moment of entry. I confirm my daughter was released medically fit after ingesting 89 Seroquel tablets. Making a turnaround justified acknowledgement from both of us that change was required for a different result. I fully appreciated and respected my daughter's decision to unlabel her identity held to government disability funds. She rightly explained how disability payments held a far more diminishing factor in holding stigma than its monetary worth. Governments profess their support to compile a variation of government payments to assist the people, and praise is given in part for this assistance. However, on the downside, it is feared that enablement becomes the greater problem when deliberate refusal to be removed from a payment by choice hones more influence to income stream than a psyche mental degradation to feel broken and not normal. To have almost seen an immediate change in my daughter's mindset alone was not without conflict, as we were advised to remain on this payment to receive the upcoming annual supplement, failing on 2 occasions to comply to our request. A third request heard a pin drop as I raised my voice to refuse to leave until my request was granted. In this process, strong realization evidenced no transition support from a carer role to a normal habitat. Placing us on a healing journey, we finally did that road trip we so often spoke of but never actioned. Excitement filled our bones as we looked at the map laid flat down on the carpet. We looked at pictures and read up about all the small towns we wished to pass through. We wondered if Uluru would be our first or our last destination. This remains a last destination. We mapped out free and cheap entry national parks and jotted down a list of essential requirements, keeping on top of media report coverage of the current bushfires. Family and friends thought it utter madness, 3 women travelling alone like gypsies over New South Wales terrain. Some even laughed in our faces. I thought of how mindsets were so trapped in the belief that a man safeguards a woman in the capacity of physical strength and power. Does this not place unfair inadequacy, then, on intellect and intelligence as a capacity? Our road trip saw many wonderful places and met wonderfully interesting people. The freedoms felt indescribable, to highlight that there are no limits unless you believe so. Someone once said, the only limitations held to self are internal. Our first location set up camp at a free national park called Ellenborough, LGA Port Macquarie Hastings Council, possibly one of the most remote and isolated demographics visited. It held to its surrounds an eeriness with dark energies. Almost immediately, I saw the murders of 3 tourists, 2 females and a male, whose remains were not found and remains still today secrets of the land. As with the disappearance of a child of an Aboriginal tribe on that same land taken by reptilian seeds, I sat along the cobbled lake in mourning and acknowledgement and held their tears in mine. One of Australia's notorious serial killers had stood previously in Archangel Michael's channeled guidance in relation to true events since childhood to also immediately be on this land with his family. Throughout our travels, I delivered many free, intuitively guided messages, most rewarding to lean into first thought, only to be led a pragmatic lifestyle to deliver a final crossing to be witness to karmic justice served. I have immense difficulty placing a monetary value to higher service. Sadly, though, some psychics and natural healers monopolize on their spiritual gifts to lose focus of why they hold their gifts in the first place, to live more in ego than in humbleness. When reference is made to crossover assistance, some believe that a passed over person immediately returns to heaven. Sadly, this belief, being incorrect, also has some believing their loved ones are having a good time with the angels, when in truth crossing over energy grids held to invisible ley lines, significance in frequency matter, takes below and up to fourth dimensional placements. The job of a natural healer to be able to hold dark mass to transmute to light frequency in unconditional love. This to a knowing, to be physically experiencing a soul's last moments prior to death, to have no choice but to remain in isolation, in a divine guidance brought by God's hand alone, to place healers in dangerous situations, to believe in their intuition, to stay alive, to bring light to the darkest places. If a medium says a soul is too dark to channel, then who brings that soul to light? My daughter completed her education through distance learning to obtain a Business Management Certificate 3 that would later enable entry and an offer at 17 to the National Institute of Dramatic Arts, NIDA. Diploma of Stage and Screen Performance. Sadly, her anxieties at that time prohibited her present future, and her continual progress saw many positive leaps as we hiked through bushland trails, swam under waterfalls, and drove dirt roads to nowhere and somewhere. We laid our heads down in cabins and tents and very hot caravans in the middle of summer. Other times we slept in our car close to 24-hour service stations, to be noticed in safe measures as we were unable to afford paid accommodation. We walked on beaches and dived through waves, spoke of dreams held, and debated on topics of interest. A specific event unfolded that labelled me crazy and dabbling in witchcraft by the judgments of family members, calling me unproductive for sitting in focus to a swinging pendulum. I found this conceptual mindset naive and misunderstood. To hold channeling modality tools does not justify energy work alone, and to grade implementation of energy healing, respectively, does not rely on man-made modalities. Personal tarot readings became future forewarnings. One such had to do with a family member's travel plans to have predicted COVID-19 7 months prior to its outbreak. I told him he was to be diverted to Berlin Airport on return to Australia. He laughed, stating that he had no plans to be in Berlin. Salvador Dali's Melting Clock was the image I received, to be transposed from Andorra to Berlin Airport, with the words "controlled chaos," to reveal masked faces and bodies sleeping on airport floors, as I firmly reiterated that this was not a hold-up or a bomb scare. 7 months later, I received a call from Berlin Airport as he ran against time as borders started to close. Building up to the occurrence with my daughter that had held false judgment, carried unfairly on my back, she became agitated and partly bored with life. For a couple of days she had become fixated on death and questioned the certainty of suicide to not result in a vegetative state due to a failed attempt. Archangel Michael showed me immediately the image of her mobile phone's history pertaining to ways to suicide successfully. I asked her to bring me her phone to validate this, and explained to her that ultimate choice lay in her hands alone, to be accountable for her actions. Honestly, I was so sick and tired of this continuous open-ended cycle that shouting at her in anger to obtain shelf medication at her own discretion if she so wished to die was not my thinking she would actually do this. Past patterns held revelation to begging for help to die as she sat on her bed counting out pills 1 minute and being fine the next. I knew from many direct experiences that staying calm was key to not overreact in allowance to her to form an expression. I also knew when medical assistance was required to not jump ahead, wasting valuable and precious time to understand understaffed medics. All of this was perceived negatively by a family member's belief that I had tried to murder my daughter. Her overdose that day did not present an overdose in accordance to an emergency department's blood test results, validation to ideation only. It was I who vomited out her contents at the instruction of Archangel Michael, as I felt myself go into a comatose state, to plead with my guide for allowance to rest for a while. Archangel Michael became demanding to show me an empty shopping bag close to where I lay, to involuntarily start to vomit more than I had ever seen. It was I who carried the physical pain of liver and kidney damage for over 2 weeks, neither eating nor sleeping, as I cleared stuck energies held to my aura under running water. An open acknowledging of light beings, looking down on an Octorian starseed, believing to carry more grief corresponding with others' pain, held on in prayer to God's highest and only will to bring karma in correlation to closed, deliberate pagan demonic games who try to break through Archangel Michael's protection of gold and blue light. People don't realize the alignment quo that dark portals can only be opened to unprotected portals holding dark intentions. Archangel Michael became that night likened to a false god in sheep's clothing. No person has power alone, and no power invested in God is without reason for the highest outcome for all humanity. A clear sky brought cloud formations, acknowledgements became immediately clear, playing out a picture strip to look to my true north node, to Archangel Michael's request to reveal the numeric 7, bringing justice back to Dharma as God's gavel cleared karmic debts held to deliberate black magic curses brought from past lives and bloodlines, to watch God cover light over all images, to validate God is watching, hiding again to bring back a clear sky. One afternoon, as we walked up from the beach, I suddenly stopped at the revelation that 5 tourist bodies lay in the thick bushland, as I pointed my finger in the direction of the energies. 3 days later, bushland was cordoned off as forensics placed dug up bones on a temporary work table. All such deliverances held to the northern rivers denoted the absence of notification due to mainland corruption facilitating a murder field. It seemed the harder I worked, the harder I had to work to sustain our basic needs. In all respects, it is easy to shout, "Live your dream," when you are not the one carrying unfair weight and responsibilities. It is easy to build a career or complete an apprenticeship without hindrance of family obligations, children's homework, and milestone annoyances. It is easy to abuse kindness, feigning proper payment for services rendered. Easy to forget and to place deliberate destruction on a single mother's life and livelihood, uncaring to watch her fall. Trying so hard always to do the just thing, I remained in a holiday park's grounds to again pay outstanding rental arrears that transpired when my vehicle became unroadworthy and I had to rent a vehicle to bring myself to visitations in a psychiatric facility where my daughter was being treated. I again secured employment. Completing the housekeeping trial, a shadow entered the main bedroom, and without looking back, I started to inquire about an issue, work-related, thinking that the head housekeeper had entered to sign off completion satisfactory. As I turned in her direction, I saw a slim, elegant woman of class move towards the writing desk. She stood in a moment of loss, feeling so terribly alone, before she picked up the pen to write her suicide note. For the first time in a long time, I gained my own equilibrium. I made friends and shared meals, laughter, and conversations. Specific to a couple older than I, whose friendship I truly valued, conversed on an interesting and intellectual level of communication that I had so missed and yearned for. I borrowed a push bike that they later gave me to cycle to work and back. The funniest memory comes to mind as pedals turn and the husband of this wonderfully united couple runs alongside the pushbike, shouting nervous encouragement, like a father would to ensure the safety of a child learning to ride a bicycle for the first time. I was so touched by their kindness. Mostly, though, I stuck to myself, keeping everyone at a distance. As I piled the last of my belongings in the unroadworthy vehicle, I shut the boot, taking back my driver's license from the manager's outstretched hand, who was already signaling a thumbs up to a parked police vehicle that had remained parked for over an hour as officers watched me walk back and forth, carrying my belongings to the car. I was confused as I had made the necessary arrangements for the scrapping of my vehicle, and I had a payment plan in place for rental arrears owing on the cabin, borrowing a tent from the very same manager to move to an unpowered site. The family on the site next to me offered to help me set up my tent. As a woman hugged me tightly, I burst into tears. I so desperately needed rest. On the other side of me lay a well-established camp setup with a marquee kitchen and a disposable shower. The gentleman older than myself resembled India's Sadhguru in physical appearance. On his site stood a parked green and red truck reminding me of a circus truck. Scanning my immediate new location, I noticed from the van's open back doors a large bookshelf holding many books of all sizes referencing India, wondering momentarily if he too held interest and followed Sadhguru's teachings. My son and nephew had completed the online portion of Sadhguru's inner engineering course, and they were meant to fly to Melbourne to participate in the finalization of the course. A day prior to departure, I told them they will not be going to Melbourne, as I held forewarning of a plane falling from the sky into the ocean, and I presented physical symptoms of drowning and hypothermia. Their flight was cancelled due to strong winds and unfavourable flying weather conditions. Whispered deliberations were held as my neighbours huddled in a group before Sadhguru lookalike officially made his acquaintance. Pushing away the thought that he appeared more like a cult leader, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. He befriended me over the next couple of days and offered me shared dinners inside his marquee kitchen. He seemed to know everyone, and everyone, including management, seemed to take instruction from him. He too seemed to hold privileges to make money on site, offering incentives for continued yoga classes and spiritual mentoring. I sat quietly, always observing people. One evening, as we had dinner, I questioned his India connection and interest to the books I had seen on his shelf as we were in discussion about belief systems. He became evasive and dismissed my line of questioning. Without explanation, most of the friends I had made started to become nasty and ridiculing as open, unused condoms lay in the sand outside my tent, and neighbours moved to other sites. I felt watched as I stretched through my morning's exercise routine. I felt watched as I zipped my tent closed to walk on the beach. I felt watched as I made my way to the swimming pool or the communal kitchen block. Everywhere I went, I felt watched. Voices directly outside my tent were heard every night for approximately 1 week, as bodies remained standing, not passing by to communal blocks or back to sites. On numerous occasions I returned to my tent to find it unzipped and open. The entire park's lawn had been maintained on a regular basis, except my fortnightly paid and up-to-date site that was deliberately unkept. By this time the rental arrears on the cabin was almost paid up, as well held to cash and electronic payments. As I sat embracing the fresh air and sunshine, a woman's voice interrupted my peace to ask specifically for me. Prior to this interruption, I had watched a group of people with tags hanging from their necks walking nervously in the park to believe they represented a company. I was surprised that the stranger knew my name, and even more surprised by her intrusion as she relayed her facts to being advised by management to sort me out directly due to my homelessness. I looked at her in shock, stating then that all campers deserved a visit from her and her group. Why just me? She continued nervously to struggle through a set questionnaire that held little significance to homelessness and no real and raw line of questioning to the realities of why people become homeless. She was wasting my time and energy. However, I proceeded to play along. I stormed down to reception to hear from the horse's mouth her truth. The horse was not available. The following morning, as most mornings, I was up early enjoying my coffee at a picnic table near the communal kitchen, and almost gulping my coffee down, I was already thinking of my planned day ahead. As I placed my backpack on my back, I gently touched the bark of the tree where my bike leaned, and I whispered good morning. The bushland on the park's perimeter had been cordoned off with portable fencing by the council, and I had heard that my special tree was to be cut down in one razor blade along with a clearing of bushland. I too had watched men at work, taking soil samples and bending down to make close observation as soil was picked up and then let go from their open hands. My intuition said dangerous sewage chemicals had seeped into God's land. As my hand lay gently on the bark, I told my special tree, "Fight and show them, for human eyes see only death when there is so much life in the buds waiting to sprout." Pleased with my grocery shop of fresh fruit and liquid iron from the pharmacy, I started pedaling home, enjoying the sun on my skin, when for no apparent reason I toppled off my bike as I lost my balance. As fast as I fell in confusion, I got up in confusion, placing immediate knowing to my limbs' sudden paralysis, as though my motor coordination became confused. Resting on a rock under a tree, I continued to giggle as I replayed my slow motion fall in my head, trying to put reasoning to this occurrence. Inquiring again at reception why management had not come back to me, I paid my fortnightly rent. Stopping on the way to talk to my ex-neighbour and her middle son, I told them how I had plummeted off my bike, as both stared at me like they had just seen a ghost. Again my tent zipper was open, and a rotting red apple sat on the chair outside. Both mother and son continued to hold various conversations with others. However, their eyes did not leave me as I opened both tent entrances and rolled up the material window flaps as I watched the horse approach me. She was not friendly and began shouting that complaints of harassment were made by her staff against me. I had no clue what this meant, as open shock was displayed on her face that I knew about payroll timelines divulged by one of her receptionists to the reason she had not been available since the homeless visit. As I spoke softly, her defense cut me off rudely, to suddenly take a gentler approach to organize for my site's lawn to be cut soon. I could feel tears building up inside my emptying shell as a park came to a standstill to watch with curiosity the drama unfold on my site. Sadhguru look-alike lay on a yoga mat within direct view of my open tent, not once breaking eye contact as he lifted his hips in a pulsating movement more as an intimidation than a genuine yoga workout. As I lay back on my mattress ignoring him, without warning I suddenly felt so ill, my body, specific to my right upper side, instantaneously stiffened, to liken this most closely to rigor mortis. As I slowed down my breathing, he smiled at me, still in a yoga pose, and made a waving motion with one hand, as if bidding me farewell. I heard only Archangel Michael's voice telling me that soon I will go to the emergency department as my phone rang. Unable to sit up, I turned on my side to press the callback button and place my phone on loudspeaker to request urgent help. My daughter placed an emergency call for an ambulance. This would be the second time police officers watched and did nothing. Paramedics became irate as they were refused entry into the park, as a boom gate remained closed to prevent urgent medical attention, to be further instructed to remain off the grass to reach me, as the horse ran ahead of the ambulance in an open smirk to reach my tent first and voice loudly, "What now?" I had known instantly that I had been poisoned as I looked her directly in the eye and said, "Migraine." Paramedics worked fast to get me out of there, and helping me out of my tent, one asked if I was strong enough to walk, while the other grabbed my bag and zipped my tent closed. Holding my head high, I placed one foot in front of the other, as onlookers stood in disbelief, mouths gaped wide open. One bystander was so visibly distraught, she had to turn away as I lost my balance. Only once in the ambulance did I speak. "It's not a migraine," I said to the kind paramedic as tears emerged. 8 mils of morphine was injected into my bloodstream before reaching the hospital. I was placed in cubicle 8 as my mental awareness validated no other patients in the vicinity. A male nurse tried to locate a vein in my right arm as a female nurse stood on the left side of the bed. I lay silently, noting how her name was spelt with a C instead of the original K, and I looked at the tattoos on her arms, as the male voice began to annoy me with more excuses than results. As he gave up, the female nurse tried to get a vein from my left arm, and as my anger rose, I told Archangel Michael, "If they want blood, give them blood. to not flinch as the female nurse jumped out of the way of my squirting blood that repulsed whatever had been injected into my body. Nurses surrounded me as I again placed one foot in front of the other, a little bottle in one hand to deliver a urine sample. I thought I heard them say, "Before you go home," and I did not comprehend their meaning. I could not bring logical sense to the foreground, also uncomprehending in my mind the relevance of questioning by a female doctor who appeared to be deliberately ignoring my real and truthful answers as a coldness displayed in her mannerism. A male doctor I recognized from a prior admission for a spider bite walked up the passage with a pizza delivery in his hands to smile broadly to ask if I am all right before turning and disappearing out of sight. I fell into a deep sleep. I was awoke in the early hours of the morning to Archangel Michael's deliberate instruction to remove myself immediately from the emergency department and to focus only on Archangel Michael's voice as he guides me to safety. Still, I noticed no occupants in any of the other cubicles. As I approached the only two people on the floor, who sat at a reception desk talking quietly to each other, I interrupted their conversation to remove the feed from my hand and to phone a cab from the landline. No portrayal of an emergency department's hustle and bustle existed, as I thought I am going mad. I sat on a pavement in the car park as the fresh morning air hit my face. I do not recall exact time I arrived back in the park, to crawl back into my tent, to continue sleeping for a couple of hours before waking and feeling rushed as instinct told me to leave the park. As I grabbed my bag and zipped up my tent, a fire twirler, also seeming more local than a holidaying passerby, offered condolences as he bent down investigating the soil around my tent. I knew in that moment more than one person was involved in this madness, and Sadhguru lookalike was momentarily unable to hide the shock on his face as he held a wooden bat above his head. I turned away from them and walked out of the park. The next couple of days may have been the most difficult ever experienced, to say that I thought I was dying. Staring into a bathroom mirror and into my dark pupils, I believed that I was experiencing a drug withdrawal as I writhed in pain and overexhaustion. 2 days later, I boarded a domestic flight to Sydney. Today, my personal belongings have remained in that park, confirmation of past communications with management and reception staff. Written communications to the park's CEO received no direct response. However, indirect association held to a legal representative. Police cars followed me in New South Wales towns, trying to intimidate me in clear daylight. They sat watching motel rooms and followed slowly behind me as I walked on pavements. The day of my rape started out like any other in the couple of days under my new roof, held to a location in Parks, in a house share containment offered by a friend at a cheaper rent. She herself would not often be there, she said, and there was only one other boarder, a male whom she trusted. The thing is, I never felt threatened until I did, and then it was too late. We had spoken over coffees and dinners, even laughed together, sharing family stories. Never once was there intimate discussion or presumption thereof. I was offered rum, and then another glass was refilled. As he placed the last glass down on the table, he moved right up against me. Jerking my head back from his intentional kiss, I asked him to please move away from me. He became someone else as a harshness emerged. My heart stopped as he instructed me to go shower. My breathing became constricted as I remained seated, and my brain started to think of the best scenario to get out of there. I remained frozen in my chair, showing no outward panic as I continued to make casual conversation in hope to diverge the situation. I knew that by car alone, and I didn't have one, it was over an hour's drive back to Orange. I had no clue what was in the other direction. Becoming highly agitated, he was now shouting at me to go shower. Sadly, I knew that I was compromised, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. I was in trouble, as I stood watching the shower water run from its spout, and I thought what would happen if I just remained behind the closed door. But everything in me knew that compliance, if played correctly, would spare my life. I knew I had to keep calm, approaching this trapped situation with no fear. To destabilize a man's power in the face of fear. I portrayed a false confidence that became actioned as a performance of role play, as my nakedness climbed on top of this stranger and my heart broke. He started shouting, "Yeah, baby, you're so wet." I was dry as a cork. My insides turned as he began to slap me. His soft penis struggled as much as his internal frustration, as his own weakness became evident to both of us. He used physical force to keep me on my stomach by pulling my hair so far back to lift my chest from the mattress that I was unable to move as he desperately tried to masturbate himself hard, stopping and jerking, as vaginal and anal penetration gained a further betrayal to a little boy's internal carnage, propagandized by sexuality even in adulthood. I may have been raped that night into the morning hours, but his pain would always be deeper than mine. I shouted at God repeatedly that I just wanted my miracle, the same familiar smile that had smiled at me from the television screen so long ago. I needed him to breathe for me. I needed to hear my heart beat in his. A lot remained in confusion to the lead up of being compromised. I had sat messaging my twin, to my own surprise, as to why I was telling her, should something happen to me resulting in death, that a murder inquiry was to be opened. I had not yet felt threatened. My sister was praised for driving over 10 hours, while my parents did not believe that I had not enticed a man's behavior as a mutual consensus. I opened the front door as 3 police officers stood asking to come inside, following up a phone call made to check on my mental state. I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch a wall. I wanted so much to believe in family protection, but there was none. I brought to their attentions immeasurable stresses held to immigration proceedings with unjust outcomes, and not mentioned a word about being raped, as I felt clouded and struggled to put words into sentences as my mind went blank. Satisfied with my validation, they left, but within the hour, as I walked on pedestrian paving to be out of the house for my safety, a police car followed me, staying behind my stride to move at a snail's pace and then stop before starting up again. Deliberate open intimidation became my thinking, because not at any time did an officer emerge from the vehicle to question or book me for something. I called on my private tarot clients to make money to leave parks. Thank you to each of you for carrying me without question. I told nobody of my rape until I had left, and then only my family and close friends. I did not report my rape, believing this would only place me in greater danger, as police corruption had already prevailed from one town to another. By this time I was barely able to stand, as medical procedures followed at a sexual assault clinic in Newcastle. My body could take no more. I wanted to lay down and never get up. I desperately needed someone to lean on, but nobody came. My sister placed my silences and tearful outbursts as a direct insinuation and insult to treating her unfairly. She slammed the door shut and walked out to leave me alone in a rat-infested motel room where I could not even lift my head from the pillow as I vomited the strong prescription medication from my system. Bereavement tore through bone and flesh, ripping and hurting and oozing scars that remained bleeding through time, patched up in whichever way to survive. This was my realization at the slamming of the door. 2 little blonde-haired, blue-eyed babies, talking their own language in pain and hope, love and resentment, afraid to fall, courageously not. Now homeless, I knew I was in trouble, deep, because no matter my mind's determination and will, without physical strength to raise my tired body, I was as good as dead. An organization for the safety of women and children in life-threatening circumstances became assigned, strangely to my sister, whom was not eligible herefore, placed me in a refuge. This environment evidenced more danger behind its facade to protect and care for the fallen ones than was exposed. This brings again the question raised to proper healing methods and modalities to replace old ineffective systems where so few recover under this government treaty. I saw so much pain in others' eyes, each holding on desperately, some days for something, other days for nothing, wanting to believe, then forced to give up due to dehumanization and segregation. Some, for weeks, received no case manager support. Others simply hid behind closed bedroom doors to hibernate in fear and lost motivation. I was patted down by an ex-prison convict to be taking top dog position to her mind, the only way of life she knew, and she was not about to lose this position. She was so accustomed to bringing war to be validated on false power, when all she really wanted was to crumble in a heap and break on the outside as she had on the inside. She wanted only to be seen. She didn't realize, or perhaps she did, that I had seen her through a hard exterior that had helped her survive. Her musical talent and ableness to be anything she wished to be was there in her very palm. To become her greatest disappointment would be to not have the correct healing tools to claim change, because the only deliberation in her mindset was that she was not loved and cared about. A sister and brother were placed in a separate house on the refuge grounds to have strict instruction against access to the main house. How does this facilitate healing, to feel so unseen and set aside as time wasters for caseworkers to reprimand uncleanliness rather than putting in place respective help to teach basic skills? Because you see, if one caseworker had listened to their story, they would have understood that a sister didn't run free and laugh from her belly. She, under little or no adult guidance, played dress up every day to care for her brother. So while you caseworkers can reminisce on your childhood dress up memories, remember, a sister was performing a live show every night without rehearsal, without guidance. To both, I applaud you greatly for the many positive changes you have brought to your lives and to mine. Please know that you are so loved, and I am truly proud of you. Bring your talents to this world to make it a better place. I was up early each morning and spent most of the time outside, in fact writing this book with the company of a cat called Socks, who sat on my lap to hear my story. I made no judgments on behaviors, understanding well that most who passed this safety threshold had been deemed unfit for society under one category or another. I listened as some shared parts of their own stories. I caught some when they fell. I saw so much beauty and talent in each one of them having the courage to survive, and today some of them remain my friends and family, one of which holds Carol's heart. As I sat listening to mothers who sadly lost their babies over drugs, I thought, what if a neonatal abstinence syndrome baby was placed in my care, holding a dual healing to incorporate the strengthening of bonds rather than the breaking of bonds in a safe and calm environment to mother and child, using only natural elements to prevent the crawling of sensitive skin and to incorporate proper diets in accordance with main blood groups. The same organisation that placed me in a dangerous refuge also placed me in one of New South Wales' socio-economic housing experiments located on an industrial site holding three four-storey colour-coded blocks. The level of danger protects each floor to hold an elevator fob that brings each one to their respective level. Individual keys access stairwell exits when elevators have been vandalised and damaged. When our poor living conditions become nobody's accountable error, this lends little credence in being born free and equal in dignity and rights. We are human beings despite our traumas, and it is every one of our moral and legal duty to respect such. What, in fact, then constitutes murder? Because all degrees are held to legal stature, respectively a man-held law and calculation system to formulate severity of punishment for unjustly taking a life. A final judgment is prosecuted to find no unreasonable doubt held to a murderous act, as a body discovered is brought to justice, its revelation a body bag zipped closed to shut out the stench of death. Evidence is placed in numerical queue to await final closure in the form of a piece of paper that states cause of death, murder. What then constitutes murder in life, not death? No evidence of a lifeless body, no tangible proof of unreasonable doubt, no body bag representing the life and the death of the nameless one. Where is this legal calculation tool? What is its formula? Who decides on its severity of punishment held? How many little lives are callously murdered every day during grooming processes? To remember once, a long time ago, the echo of a child's laughter spilt out from a limitless soul. Where are their death certificates stating murder in the first degree, to bring closure to their lives lost and the injustices against purity? That very hand that placed food and warmth and security to a family's basic needs, that very hand, once open, became hardened and turned into a fist, as pressure built to need an outlet, to be sorry and to hold guilt in inadequacy, but to do it again and again and again, to pay it forward to the adult child who is stopped and handcuffed and in a holding cell in detention, burning and waiting to lash out a pain unseen and unspoken, to also do it again and again and again. Where is this date and time of murder, declaring its death to a final decree? The man on the street prays to God to bring his tired, weathered, beaten body to safety in an alcove away from the lashing, deliberate wind against his cheek, making his eyes water. He thinks he hears his children call his name. He thinks he hears their laughter in the wind as he bows his head in gratitude and sorrow to stare for no real reason at a newspaper's yesterday news. Smoothing out the crinkles over his outstretched legs, he thinks he is dreaming. Who is that man wearing the expensive suit, being respected for his title and by his fellow man? Once hard-working and successful, a homeowner, a family man, sitting tonight in a dark, cold alcove, convulsing in the harshness of murder in the first degree. For sure as the blue, blue sky, alive or dead, every murdered soul holds a starting point to become unravelled in unopportune circumstance. Does this sanctify fate or simply one's destiny? My guess is that planet Earth was destined for peace, and it is by no fate that we are here to make that difference. Chapter 11: Stolen Moments from Failed Government Systems. A Message for All Humanity. Written and recorded January 26, 2021. Transcribed March 6, 2022. I hold to this day a most important message for all of humanity to please stand together in forging change, specific to worldwide humanitarian and sensitive real-life events where corruption weakens our protection and human rights systems, allowing unjust silences to prevent positive change. Today holds strong significance to what is known as Australia Day, specified to persons receiving citizenship under oath, to pledge loyalty to Australia and its people, respecting democratic beliefs, rights and liberties, and obeying laws. The term democracy is that it provides an environment that respects human rights and fundamental freedoms, and in which the freely expressed will of people is exercised. Governments hold a moral and legal duty to all human beings, irrespective of country, culture, and context, born free and equal in dignity and rights. I urge all countries to stop and listen to its people, whose basic human rights and protection laws are failing humanity on a scale so large that families everywhere, every day, are dealing with inhumane crisis complexities, some to the point where stress-related illness or even death occurs. As I'm sure we can all appreciate, sets of regulations and rules applied, specific to the nature of government bodies, through their own tailored to the people's needs, policies and procedures, held in relation to the nature of support offered. I do wish to raise concerns and suggestions, and I ask to be heard without prejudice. I ask for legislation relating to child protection and basic human rights to be reviewed and re-evaluated, to hold less rigid guidelines across the board and more humane awareness and compassion with out-of-the-box thinking. This strongly includes immigration ministerial intervention procedures, pending at length and holding documented evidence relating to these human rights topics. Please, those with clout, use the people's personal experiences and losses to bring forth amended, less flawed acts that duly will hold weight in delivering a better, stronger support system. Use the people's knowledge, not studied through books nor holding degrees, but experienced through heart-breaking, heart-wrenching self-experiences. Use the people's personal stories to derive proper and correct protection laws, hence bringing back to its core the scales of justice. Use the people's personal day-to-day coping strategies as part of in-house training programs to create jobs for the people. Holding more crisis skill and survival skill than all of a library's knowledgeable books. To this important message, I also raise the competencies of mental health institutions, lacking competent abilities to allocate to their awareness programs proper and correct healing methods. Respectively, this is that moment where labels become a problem within a problem due to dehumanization and self-infliction to those struggling, segregated and disconnected, to be in most emergency departments the time wasters, either laughed upon or ignored. In a duty of care environment, all those stolen moments can never be revived. I ask tonight that every person listening to this message pass it forward in forgiveness and kindness to one another. Stand not on the fence, but in truth, that all of us, from poor white South Africans to presidents and prime ministers, all four corners of the earth, do the right thing in realizing that to hold accountability for monumental errors means also to appreciate change of laws on a monumental scale that reunites nations. I thank you for your time.